The envelope was sitting on the break room table when everyone arrived Monday morning. No name on it. No return address. Just a plain white envelope with a single word written on the front in neat black ink. Open. By 9 in the morning, 11 people had walked past it. Not one of them touched it. Charles Whitfield had built his company from a single delivery van and a storage unit he rented for $400 a month. That was 22 years ago. Now Whitfield Logistics operated across 14 states, employed over 300 people, and had contracts with some of the largest retail chains in the country. Charles was 60 years old, sharp, quietly spoken, and had a habit of standing near the window of his top-floor office watching the loading dock below for long stretches of time without saying anything. His assistant Margaret had worked with him for 16 years, and she still could not always tell what he was thinking. That was intentional. Charles believed that the moment people knew exactly what you were thinking, they stopped showing you who they really were. He had started noticing things 3 months ago. Small things. A shipment that arrived with missing inventory that nobody could explain. A petty cash drawer that came up short twice in 1 quarter. A client complained about a delivery that 3 different employees each claimed they had no knowledge of. None of it was catastrophic. None of it made headlines. But Charles had not built what he built by ignoring small things. Small things were where the truth lived. He said that to Margaret once, and she wrote it down because she had learned to write down the things Charles said quietly, because those were always the ones that mattered. He spent 2 weeks thinking about what to do. He could have installed more cameras. He could have brought in an external audit firm. He could have called individual employees into his office one by one and asked direct questions. He had done all of those things before in his career, and he knew their limitations. Cameras made people careful, not honest. Audits found numbers, not character. Conversations in his office produced polished answers from nervous people, not truth. He wanted something else. He wanted to see what his people did when they thought nobody was watching and when something was genuinely at stake. He called his most trusted advisor, a retired businessman named Harold who had known Charles since the delivery van days, and explained what he was planning. Harold listened and then said, "That is either very wise or very strange." Charles said, "Probably both." The first test was the envelope. Charles placed it himself on the break room table at 6:45 on Monday morning before anyone else arrived. Inside the envelope was $500 in cash and a handwritten note that said simply, "This belongs to someone. Please return it to the front desk." No other information. No name. No explanation. Just the money and the instruction. He wanted to see what happened. He had set up a small camera disguised as part of the ventilation panel above the table 3 days earlier. He watched the footage from his office. By 9 in the morning, 11 people had walked past without touching it. By 10:30, 2 people had stopped, looked at it, and kept walking. At 11, a man named Gary from the warehouse team picked it up, looked inside, closed it again, and put it in his jacket pocket. Charles watched this on the small screen on his desk without changing his expression. Gary was 43, had worked in the warehouse for 6 years, and had received a performance bonus just 2 months earlier. Charles made a note. At 12:15, a young woman named Priya from the accounts department came into the break room for lunch. She noticed the envelope immediately. She looked around the room. She picked it up, opened it, read the note, and within 4 minutes was standing at the front desk asking the receptionist whose envelope this was and explaining exactly where she had found it. Charles watched this and made another note. But the envelope was only the beginning. The second test came the following week. Charles asked Margaret to arrange a situation where a significant error would appear in the company accounts. Not a real error. A staged one. A false invoice for $8,000 from a vendor that did not exist slipped into the payment queue. He wanted to see who caught it, who ignored it, and most importantly, what whoever caught it would do about it. The invoice was processed through the regular system on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, 3 people in the finance department had handled paperwork that included it. None of them flagged it. Charles waited. On Friday morning, a man named David, who was the most junior member of the finance team, only 8 months into his job, sent an email to his direct manager saying he had noticed a vendor invoice that did not match any existing supplier contract, and that he wanted to flag it before it was processed further in case it was an error. His manager replied and said she would look into it. She did not look into it. She forwarded the email to her own manager and said she had it under control. Her manager filed the email and did not respond. David, Receiving no reply by Friday afternoon, sent a second email directly to the finance director's office, politely but clearly, saying he was concerned the invoice might represent a compliance risk and that he felt it needed urgent attention before payment was authorized. The finance director's assistant, a man named Kevin, intercepted the email, sent David a brief reply telling him the matter had been escalated and was being handled, and then deleted the original email without forwarding it anywhere. Charles had access to all of this. He sat in his office on Friday evening after everyone else had gone home and read through every email in the chain 3 times. He made 3 notes that evening. David, underlined twice. The manager who forwarded and forgot, 1 note. Kevin, who had deleted an escalation email to protect himself from someone else's diligence, circled in red. The third test was the one Charles found most difficult to design because it required something more personal. He had heard from Margaret, who heard things because she was Margaret and Margaret always heard things, that there were employees who were billing personal expenses to company accounts. Small amounts. A tank of gas here. A lunch that was not a business lunch there. The kind of thing that was easy to justify and easy to miss. Charles decided to make it very easy for someone to do this on a larger scale and see who walked through the door he was opening. He arranged for a company credit card to be issued to 6 different employees across different departments for what was described as a research and development project. The card had a limit of $3,000. The project parameters were vague on purpose. Employees were told to use the card for any expenses they felt were relevant to exploring new operational methods and to submit a summary at the end of the month. What happened over the following 4 weeks was more varied than Charles had expected. 2 employees used the card for entirely legitimate purposes and submitted detailed reports. 1 employee used it for 2 lunches that were borderline and wrote explanations for both that were a stretch but not impossible to justify. 1 employee did not use it at all and returned it to Margaret at the end of the month with a note saying they had not found any appropriate use and did not want to hold on to a company card unnecessarily. Charles read that note several times. The employee's name was Sandra. She worked in operations and had been with the company for 9 years, and Charles realized he had never had a direct conversation with her. That bothered him more than the 4th employee, who had used the card for $700 of personal grocery shopping and submitted an expense report describing it as team well-being supplies. Charles looked at the itemized receipt. It included breakfast cereal, laundry detergent, and 2 bottles of wine. He sat with that for a moment. But it was the 6th employee who surprised him most. A man named Tom from the regional operations team had used the card twice. Once for a business meal that was clearly legitimate, complete with names of attendees and a description of what was discussed, and once for $230 at a hardware store. Charles looked at that receipt carefully. It was not immediately obvious what $230 at a hardware store had to do with operational research. He asked Margaret to find out without asking Tom directly. Margaret, who had many quiet methods of finding things out, discovered within a day that Tom had used the card to purchase materials to repair the roof of a small community center near the regional office that was used as an after-school program for children from low-income families. The center's director had mentioned in passing to one of Tom's colleagues that they could not afford the repairs and were worried about the coming winter. Tom had said nothing about it to anyone. He had just done it and included the receipt in his expenses with a brief description that said community relations and local partnership development. Charles read this and was quiet for a long time. He called Harold that evening. Harold listened to the full summary and said, "So what are you going to do?" Charles said he was going to make some changes. Harold said, "Personnel changes?" Charles said some, but not the ones you might expect. He paused and then said, "Harold, I have been running this company for 22 years, and I have been managing people. I have not always been developing them. There is a difference." Harold said, "That sounds expensive." Charles said, "Less expensive than losing the ones worth keeping." The following Monday, Charles called a company-wide meeting. All 311 employees. It was the first all-hands meeting he had called in 4 years, and people arrived looking uncertain. The way people always look when something unexpected is called at a company and nobody has been told why. Charles stood at the front of the large conference room and looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. He said he had spent the last month learning more about his company than he had in the previous 2 years. He said he had done it in an unconventional way and that he was going to be honest about what he had done and what he had found. The room went very quiet. He explained the tests. All three of them. He did not use careful corporate language. He said he had put money on a table, a fake invoice in the system, and a credit card in people's hands, and he had watched what happened. He said he was not there to punish people this morning. He said he was there because what he had seen had forced him to ask serious questions, not just about certain individuals, but about the kind of company he had built, and whether it was the kind of company where doing the right thing was supported or whether it was the kind of place where doing the right thing put you at a disadvantage. He looked at David, the junior finance employee, and said that the most junior person in the finance team had flagged a compliance issue twice, clearly and correctly, and had been ignored by people above him and had one of his emails deleted. He said that was not David's failure. It was a leadership failure. David looked at the table in front of him. His manager, 2 seats away, did not move. Charles said that the kind of company he wanted to run was one where the most junior employee's concern received the same serious attention as a concern from the most senior one, because the truth did not care about hierarchy. He talked about Priya and the envelope without embarrassing Gary by name. He said that someone had returned $500 in cash to the front desk without being asked to do so twice, and without knowing whether anyone was watching. He said that was the kind of instinct that built trustworthy organizations, and he intended to recognize it properly. Priya sat very still in the third row. She had not known anyone was watching. She had not known it was a test. She had just returned the envelope because it was the right thing to do and the note said it belonged to someone. That was all. She felt strange now sitting in this room being talked about, and she looked at her hands. Charles talked about Sandra returning the credit card with a note. He talked about Tom and the community center roof. When he mentioned the hardware store receipts and explained what they had been for, there was a sound in the room. Not quite a gasp. Something softer than that. Several people looked at Tom. Tom looked like he wanted to be somewhere else immediately. Charles said, "I am not going to stand here and tell you that everyone in this room passed some kind of test. That is not what this meeting is about. What I want to say is this. I have watched this company grow for 22 years, and I have sometimes mistaken staying busy for paying attention. I stopped paying attention to the right things. I was watching numbers and contracts, and I stopped watching people." He paused. "That is going to change." He announced 3 things. First, David was being promoted to a new compliance integrity role that reported directly to the finance director's office, with the mandate to flag any concern at any level without fear of it being ignored or buried. Second, he was establishing a company foundation funded from his own personal account, not company revenue, to support community initiatives that employees identified. Tom's Community Center would be the first project. Third, anyone who had made choices over the past month that they were not proud of had 2 weeks to come to Margaret's office privately and discuss it. He said these conversations would be confidential and focused on resolution, not punishment. He said he was more interested in the kind of people his employees chose to be going forward than in what they had done when they thought they were invisible. Kevin, who had deleted David's escalation email, sat in the back row and did not look at anyone. Gary, who had taken the envelope, stared at the table. The manager who had forwarded David's email and forgotten it looked straight ahead with the careful expression of someone waiting to find out how much trouble they were in. After the meeting, Charles stood near the door as people filed out. Most of them nodded at him or shook his hand. Priya stopped and looked at him and said, "I did not know it was a test." He said, "I know. That is why it mattered." She thought about that and then nodded and walked out. Tom walked past quickly with his head slightly down, and Charles said his name quietly, and Tom stopped and turned around, and Charles said, "The community center roof. Was it solid work?" Tom said, "Yes, sir. Should last at least 8 years." Charles said, "Good. I want the name of the director there on my desk tomorrow." Tom nodded and kept walking, and Charles could see from the set of his shoulders that he was either going to laugh or cry once he got around the corner, and Charles understood that completely. Margaret appeared at his elbow as the last few people left the room. She handed him a coffee and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That was not what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "I expected you to fire 3 people and give a speech about integrity." He said, "I thought about it." She said, "What changed your mind?" He looked at the empty room, all those chairs, all those people who had just gone back to their desks carrying different things than they had walked in with. He said, "Harold told me once that the point of a test is not to fail people. It is to find out what they need in order to do better." Margaret said, Harold is a wise man. Charles said he is. I did not listen to him enough in the early years. Margaret said, you are listening now. He said, better late than never. She handed him a second piece of paper along with his coffee. He looked at it. It was a list of 4 names. She said, the people who came to my office this morning before the meeting even started. They did not wait for the 2 weeks. He read the names. Kevin was not on the list. Gary was. His manager was. 2 others he recognized from the credit card group. Charles folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at Margaret and said, set up the meetings. She said, already done. He nodded and picked up his coffee and walked back toward the elevator. He stopped once on the way and looked out through the large glass panel that overlooked the loading dock below. 311 people. Most of them trying. Most of them capable of more than he had given them the structure to show. He had spent 22 years building a company, and somewhere in the middle of it he had forgotten that a company was not a system. It was people, and people needed to know that the right thing was worth doing. Not because someone was watching, but because the place they spent most of their waking hours believed it mattered. He was going to make sure they knew that now. He was 22 years late to some of it, but he was standing at the window paying attention. And that, as Harold had once told him a long time ago in a storage unit on the edge of a city before any of this existed, was always the right place to start.